historian, and I'm pleased to be joined by my good friend Dr. Peter Carmichael, director of Civil War Institute, and also Cameron Sauers, CWI Fellow, class of 2021. Thank you for joining us tonight on this broadcast that we have entitled Coming Apart at the Seams, Violence, Fashion, and Race in the Civil War South. So, Pete, thank you so much for allowing me to help you with this.
Yeah, John, thank you. Sorry for our delay. Had some technical issues, but I think we're past that, and I hope everyone is staying safe and feeling healthy. Let me just say a little bit more about Cameron, who is about ready to finish his third year at Gettysburg College. He has spent 2 of his summers as a Pohanka Fellow. His first summer was at Harpers Ferry National Park, and last summer he stayed at CWI and helped us with the Civil War Institute conference. He is off to Antietam this summer if there is a seasonal program, and that is a big if. I hope that things will work out for him. And so I'm pleased that Cameron this evening has decided to share with us some of his research that he did actually for me last fall, research that was on the diary of Kate Stone. The book is entitled Broken Burn. And I'll have Cameron talk a little bit about Kate as well. There's some, Cameron, why don't you go ahead and hold that up a little bit longer?
That's a very well-loved and annotated copy of Kate Stone's diary.
It is.
It's very impressive. Do you actually do notations in your book as well, or you just...
Yeah, there's some, there's some sloppy handwriting in there and some notes on the tabs.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Students using their books. It's a beautiful thing. So, Cameron, why don't you tell us a little bit what led you to Kate Stone, and why should she matter to us?
Yeah, so the genesis of working with Kate Stone's diary came down to the fact that I had acquired it somehow. I picked it up. I buy a lot of books. And the central kind of question for our research papers in the fall course I had with you on the Civil War was to find a specific incident in a primary source that seemed unexplainable and explain it. And I was captured by this excerpt as I read Stone's diary because I simply had it with me in my dorm room. I was struck by this incident that she reports, and it's the same incident that I put on the compiler for everyone to read for us to be able to discuss tonight, that I was really interested in understanding why was it so significant that this black man stepped on her dress in the bedroom during this raid that was just kind of a small incident, because she kept referring to it and seemed traumatized by it. So I was interested in why it was so significant. And so that's how I got really invested.
So Cameron, could you give us a little bit more context about the incident itself?
Yeah.
Some of our listeners, viewers have probably not had an opportunity to actually look at the document itself. So could you give us a nice summary as what happened in the household that led to this? And it's a USCT or a black soldier, correct?
No,
Who
it's
stepped on her
actually
dress?
this incident is just, it seems, a free black man in the area. There does not seem to be, she writes it in a way that's different from how she writes about her encounters with USCTs. And it's also, I think, chronologically early to have USCTs in action.
So give us the date.
Yeah.
Sorry. So what's the date and where does
So
this happen and all?
It is, I think it's March 26th, 1863. Which is significant because her family was fleeing their plantation starting the day before. Their family was it's in the Mississippi River Valley in northeastern Louisiana. So the maneuvers that Grant was having out in the Western Theater on the Mississippi River, the Union Army is encroaching near where their plantation Broken Burn is, and the family decides to flee. And they're going to head out to Texas. And as they're fleeing, they're stopping on the way. They're stopping at the homes of people they know. And one of the first homes they stop at on the first day.
And so this incident didn't occur at Broken Burn.
Correct.
At their home.
It happened at the home of a family friend. I think the last name is Hardison. They stop at their house and they arrive and they kind of wander into... The home had already been kind of gone through by enslaved, freed people. Stone's not very specific. She doesn't seem to know the African Americans that she's interacting with. And then they come back when Stone's in the house. They're all gathered, kind of recovering. The owners of the household who had been raided the first time, and it happens again. And that's where Stone experiences. And it sounds like it's about a 4-hour long encounter where the home is ransacked and their possessions are rifled through and things are taken. And then the enslaved leave, and Stone and her family just makes an even quicker dash out to Texas.
I think one of the things that I was struck by in reading it again is that the band of African Americans, of free people, that they're armed, they've got guns, and it's clear that most white folks were not accustomed to seeing African Americans, especially those enslaved, carrying weaponry. And it also, I think they justified, the black folks did, in going into the home to look for additional weapons as well.
Yeah.
So that's the pretense. They go into the house, storm inside the house. Then what starts to happen? What takes place?
Yeah. So hold on. Before I do that, I want to clarify. I'm following along. If you see me on our phone, I'm following along with your comments. Our stream started late, so if you're just joining us, we're still kind of getting underway. We started a couple of minutes late due to technical difficulties. So if you heard just kind of the incident talking about the raid, you're right on track with us. You haven't missed much. And thank you for those who are joining. Apologies again for kind of the difficulties we have. But yeah, Dr. Carmichael, to your point, one of the main things is the African Americans are coming in. We're looking for weapons. That was what they said was going on. And they didn't find any. None of the men were armed. And Stone makes a comment to the point about the lack of male protection, meaning white male protection in this instance during the raid.
Good. So they come in and they start to rummage about the private possessions in the house, and Stone has a very dramatic account of this, and the language is pretty powerful, and she is, I would say, very intentional in creating a very highly dramatic narrative, one that is racialized, in which free people are not portrayed as men with a particular interest or purpose, except to terrorize these women. And there's sexualized overtones as well throughout all of this. It's the kind of thing that is the perfect fodder for what many would believe would be a lost cause or post-war story or narrative of the Civil War. So Stone, in this issue of the dress, which fascinated you so much, could you again give us a little bit more details about this particular incident?
Yeah, so Stone, a few other women, including Stone's younger sister, are locked in a bedroom, or at least the door is shut. And that door is broken down essentially by one of the men who comes in and is first interested in the young baby of a friend that's with the Stones. And he makes quotes to the ascent of, if this baby grows up to be a gorilla, I should just kill it now. Which is obviously, I think, very traumatizing to Stone and her family. But then the raider sees
It reminded
Stone.
me, though, I'm going to interrupt you. It reminded me of the Godfather. Was it Godfather 1 or Godfather 2? I think it's Godfather 2.
I think it's 2.
When they were going to kill the boy, right?
Yeah, I think it's
And
2.
remember, he said,
Yeah.
he'll grow up and he'll eventually come after me.
Right.
And he'll come get me as well.
Yeah.
I found that to be an interesting point in her diary.
Yeah.
That this Reed person had looked at that child and said, this one day, this child might be my adversary.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Cameron.
We have Al Mackey is doing great work for us in the chat, sharing some good stuff. And Al, you are correct. This as occurs at a neighbor's house and not at Broken Burn. You're 100% right with that. But yeah, the incident that really fascinated me is just a couple of short lines where Stone says that, quote, he came right up to us standing on the hem of my dress while he looked me slowly over, gesticulating and snapping his pistol. He stood there about a minute, I suppose. It seemed to me an age I felt like I would die should he touch me. Which to me, as I read that, I was fascinated by it, and that was what really caught my interest in it. Because it's an interesting moment where something, when we talk about self-emancipation, the plantation household, that I hadn't really spent enough time with Southern Diaries to see something like this.
What does she's writing for an audience?
Yeah.
I think. I mean, even though it's a diary, this is so well choreographed in terms of the writing. And again, I want to emphasize her portrayal of these African Americans is they're a menacing lot. And again, what does she want the reader to understand about this intrusion, this Black intrusion into the white household?
Yeah. Stone is making clear to the reader of her diary that there's infringement upon what is proper in terms of both a racial context and as a gender context, about the infringement into her space as a white plantation mistress. This was the ultimate transgression, essentially, and Stone's making that clear with the entry how offensive and out of the ordinary it is.
And Cameron, I guess again, I'd like for you to help us again understand the significance of this.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to draw in terms of conclusion, right? What should we? How does this help us understand the nature of the war on the Southern home front?
Yeah, that there's really, I think the perceptions of the Southern home front, it's white women's encounters are with the Union Army coming through. That's where their violent encounters are. But Stone's diary is showing that there are threatening encounters with enslaved and free Blacks, and that from what Stone's experience is, her really most traumatic experience isn't her encounters with the Union Army. By the end of the war, I think she's hardened to kind of the experience on the home front, that it's this first incident where her role as the plantation mistress, as a white woman in the South, the first time it's being challenged, it's not from the Union Army, it's from the enslaved and free Blacks that she's dealing with. Which I think is ultimately one of the big significant factors about this incident.
John, I was going to let you go ahead if you.
I had a thought. You said in a bio of yours that you were really into material culture, and that's why this really led you to this point with this particular work. What was it about that line where she talks about he stepped on the hem of my dress? What about that jumped out at you? What was the thing that was like, wow, that's a really interesting thing to put in there, or something to say?
Yeah. John, I think that's a great question. It goes back to a piece of a book that had stuck with me. It's Stephen Barry's All That Makes a Man.
Okay.
Which is a great book. He has a section in the book where he talks about the hoop of women's skirts served as kind of an isolation form around the women, and that it prevented the space of the woman from being encroached upon when she was out in public at a store or in church, that there was always a sense of distance between women and the people near them physically, that there was boundaries, and the dress preserved them. The infringement upon those boundaries, as seen in Stone's incident, then shows that the kind of the domesticity of the woman has been infringed upon. And I was really interested in how Stone responded to that.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of what I read in Mothers of Invention.
Yes.
When we talk about the white Southern women and their feelings of class and social standing and stuff like that. And when I was reading through it, it really jumped out at me that it's a lot like what we have seen in that book. And I don't know if Drew Gilpin Faust used this in that book or not. I can't remember if this is one of her characters in that book or not. But it's a really interesting way of looking at, how, like Dr. Carmichael said, the dehumanization of these of the free people are, or they're enslaved, but they are now armed, uh, is because they actually, the line that jumped out at me, other than the part about him standing on her hem, was where she says that she made sure to say that no white men were with them, like there was no one there to quote control them in that way. That's how it appeared to me. What do you think? What do you
Yeah,
think of like that area where she says about they were completely armed and there was no white man with them? It kind of jumped out to me personally. I don't know if it did to you
yeah.
or not.
No, John, I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the differentiating factors between how Stone writes about this incident and how she writes about her encounters with USCTs in 1864 and 1865. Stone really
Mm,
believes in the paternal ideology of the South. And she wanted, and she was significantly more comfortable with African Americans when there is a white male presence around to control them.
mm,
Stone's own experience on Broken Burn Plantation, which has almost 150 enslaved at the start of the war, that Stone really is, like many Southerners, afraid of what African Americans, and especially those who are enslaved, will do without the presence of white control. And Stone's kind of worst fears that have been ingrained in the Southern mind since the Nat Turner Revolt is kind of a turning point in the Southern slave owners' relationship with their slave. Stone is, and like many Southern planters, worried about, is this the next incident? Is this the next revolt? Because she's viewing this as a slave revolt.
Everything that you've said to us, Cameron, would suggest to me that this incident, like so many others that occurred on the home front, on the southern home front, that it should tell us that the home front is actually a second battlefront.
Yes.
Uh, we talk about the home front and the military and these linkages, these connections. They're important, they're vital, and they need to be made. And historians, in fact, have been making them for more than 20 years. But I am struck by what you've described. I'm, of course, intrigued by the writing of this diary. And I did not read the introduction that Drew Gilpin Faust wrote for the reprint of the book. If you could show everyone the book again, Cameron, I think that would be helpful. There it is. Drew Gilpin Faust wrote the intro. I don't remember if she suggests that that Kate Stone came back and rewrote the diary. I'm suspicious that she wrote this in the moment because of what she just described. To think that she could have endured this incident as being a refugee on the move, making her way to Texas, and to write in prose that is incredibly polished.
mm,
Pretty remarkable, I'd say.
Well, that's
mm,
Now, it
actually
is
an
remarkable.
interesting thing. As Stone is writing this, she writes it more than a month later.
Yeah.
The diary entry, it's under, if you're reading this chronologically, this doesn't appear until almost the end of April 1863. She starts an entry and it's essentially that she is here and settled in Texas now. I'm going to tell you the story of how we got here because this is just the first
mm,
in a long line of events that she's going to end up recounting over a
right.
couple of days of entries about her experience getting to Texas because like you said, to write something this polished in the middle of the turmoil is difficult to imagine. I wouldn't be surprised if this was revised multiple times as she's writing these entries, recounting the stories, because this is an event that lingers with her for a while.
So I want to read for those who've not seen the diary, and then Cameron and John, I'm just curious on how we should handle a source like this. I think it's again would be useful for our audience as well if they get an opportunity to go to our blog. And Cameron, our blog is
It's the
called
Gettysburg Compiler.
Gettysburg Compiler. That's right. So you can go right there and you can find the document and you can either read along now or take a look at it some other time. This is the part of the diary in which Stone is describing after the former slave had picked up the baby and had threatened to hurt the baby. And then I believe he then stepped on Stone's dress. She wrote, "I was never so frightened in my life. Mrs. Hardison said we were both as white as marble, and and she was sure I would faint. What a wave of thankfulness swept over us when we went out and slammed the door. In the meanwhile, other Negroes were rummaging the house, ransacking it from top to bottom, destroying all the provisions they could not carry away." And this is a striking part here. "And sprinkling a white powder in the cistern or the well, and over everything they left. We never knew whether it was poison or not." Just want to use some other words here that she used. She referred to the laugh of those African Americans as a diabolical laugh, right? She refers to them as being fiendish. Now, this language that she employs, the adjectives that she used, right, that creates this image in our minds, an image in our minds that conforms to a very traditional way of understanding Reconstruction. Because that's what we're witnessing here. We're witnessing the destruction / reconstruction of Southern households in the middle of the war. So I'm asking both of you, and you take a whack at this. How do you handle this? How do you handle this source? Do you handle it in such a way that you take her words and you simply put it out there, as I just did, for readers and our audience to digest, to chew on? Do you interpret them? Do you question them? What do you do? Because if you just accept them as she wrote them, then you're accepting, I would say, that view of Reconstruction that's highly sanitized, that overlooks the fact that it was freed people who were often at the end of white violence. And it lifts up that story that, of course, is so powerful in Gone with the Wind. It's not a black soldier in Gone with the Wind, but it's a white soldier, right, who comes into Tara and attacks Scarlet. And who kills the soldier? No, excuse me, I got that. Yeah, attacks Scarlet. It's Melanie, right? It's Melanie who shoots down the white soldier. So how do you handle this source?
Yeah, I
What do you
actually,
do?
as you were thinking of this and how Stone is going to write in her 2 entries about Reconstruction, she writes, just like a couple of pages later in that entry, quote, "I can stand anything but Negro and Yankee raiders. They terrify me out of my wits." That, and I think when we see Stone's entry from Reconstruction, one of the main incidents is her older brother shoots a free worker on the property of Broken Burn. And I think Stone's diary needs to be taken critically. We have to consider what she's writing, because I believe, in my interpretation, is that this is her constructed worldview. Stephen Stowe, I'll plug, this was a really insightful book for me as I went through. Stephen Stowe's new book on reading the diary. It's called Keep the Days, reading the Civil War diaries of Southern women, writes about how the constructed worldview of Southern women, impacts the way that they're writing in their diaries and how they craft narratives about events. And I think Stone is doing exactly that with this, that she is looking for incidents and highlighting the ones that reinforce her racial views.
So I can't help myself, and John, you can jump in. I don't have Cameron in class this semester, so I miss picking on him, man. And so I'm going to pick on you a little bit here. When you say constructive worldview, I have a hunch that many of our listeners are like, man, what's he talking about? So what are you talking about when you say constructed worldview? What are you trying to get us to understand?
I'm thinking about one of the big things you've emphasized to us in our Southern history class is on Hugh, for the information we're talking about. We're analyzing a diary post, an excerpt from a diary that's posted on our blog, the Gettysburg Compiler. There's a brief 2-page excerpt from the diary that we've put up on the blog, if you're interested in checking that out.
And
Um,
I've linked that blog, by the way, to my page as well. So if anyone wants to look.
Wonderful. Yeah, so it's available on a recent CWI page, a direct link to that blog post, and it's also available on John's The Tattooed Historian page.
Yes.
But to Dr. Carmichael, to your point, I'm referring to paternalism, which is Stone is probably really a textbook definition of the paternal ideology, where she is looking to reinforce her beliefs that um, a good slave is faithful, loyal, a docile servant, and that there are bad slaves who are rebellious to the family or during the Civil War especially have fallen under the sway of the nearby Yankee invaders, who she thinks is corrupting the local black population.
I think it's also interesting to point out too, Cameron, uh, in the whole thing that she goes over is what they're actually taking and what they're destroying, what they're taking stuff. It's the symbolization of class. It's the symbolization of the plantation home and stuff like that as well. There's like you can see it. They're going after uh, uh, China silverware or destroying furniture or doing stuff like that. I think that's a really cool thing to point out too with the class dynamic going on in this one thing as well. Even though she's trying to uh, maybe write this for a certain audience, obviously, and get a point across in a certain way, which will lead to what we see in Reconstruction and lost causisms, and if that's a word. But it's really cool to see what they're actually targeting.
Yeah, well, John, actually, that's a lot. I'd probably say half of my paper is on Stone's kind of diary, and the other half is the importance of these dresses. And it's most of the time these fashion violence incidents are involving dresses.
Mm.
And I use this to look at how fashion played a role in enslaved women's resistance. Stephanie Camp wrote a wonderful article that, as I came to it, really influenced it. That fashion became, for enslaved women, a way to resist plantation owners. It demonstrated enslaved women's kind of agency to mark their own time when they weren't working for the masters. And at the same point, dresses and of the finest materials for Kate Stone demonstrated her position at the very top of the Southern stratosphere. You don't get much richer than Stone's family. And she writes an incident in the diary about how the family goes from dresses of the finest material at the start of the war to eventually, as the war goes on, having to pay more for their dresses, and with that money, buying dresses of less expensive and less refined material because it wasn't practical anymore. The practicality of fashion outweighed demonstrations of their class position.
Hmm.
Cameron, I think you said that really well. But again, I'm going to give you a little bit of pushback here. So, are you trying to tell all of us that in this great revolution that the Civil War wrought and the destruction of slavery, and we see it in Kate Stone's diary at the most fundamental level, the household, right? And what you're trying to tell us, and maybe I'm misunderstanding or just being argumentative, is that it's a revolution in fashion? Are you kidding me? Like everything's at stake here. You're telling me that the assertion by freed women is close. Is that the argument you're trying to make?
Yeah, yeah, I think that for freed women, one of the easiest ways, the most visible ways to demonstrate their status as newly freed people
Yes.
is through visible expressions of wealth. It allows them to express their status of freedom, but it also, at the same point, they recognize that these symbols have value for their masters. And so they're able to really get a twofold victory there in making, resistance to the master, but also demonstrating the new status of freedom.
Their independence and their autonomy.
Yes, exactly. That's the perfect way to put it.
But you've divorced it, and John, I'll let you go in there. I'll just throw that out there. You keep thinking about this. You've divorced that independence from the autonomy they had now of control of their own labor,
Yeah.
control of their own time, control of their own families, control of their own households. I mean, I think all of that comes together. That's why this document to me is so powerful. And I'll just ask both of you, for those African American men who broke into that house, who it appears were intent to simply just kind of steal and loot and destroy things, and then when they left, possibly even poisoning the well. I'm asking you all, is how do we understand that? Is that a political act? Is that just an act of sheer violence and destruction? How should our audiences understand that? Assertion of freedom, assertion of independence, revenge, pointlessness, violence, thievery? What is it?
Go ahead, Cam.
This is for our viewers. This is what a daily classroom experience is like for me now.
Yeah.
I think it's a political action. I don't think it's just violence for violence sake. I think there is a political expression with, I'll say, a majority. I think there's sometimes incidents where, especially late in the war, where there's destruction for destruction's sake. But in these pivotal moments, especially in late 1862 into 1863, African Americans are striking for freedom. And this is, I'll say, geographic specific to Stone. Different populations are experiencing freedom and violence in different ways at different points. That's part of Aaron Sheehan Dean's brilliant book, The Calculus of Violence, that there's violence in different ways in different places at different times. Stone's experiencing, I think, it earlier because she's encountering the Union armies earlier. When the Union Army is nearby, there is the ability for African Americans to strike for freedom and gain freedom and have that secured earlier than there is for people, for enslaved populations elsewhere.
Clausewitz famously said war is politics by their means. Therefore, violence is politics by their means, in my opinion. It can be seen as a political statement in that regard.
And thank you, Mr. Mackey, for backing me up in the comments against Dr. Carmichael. Al agrees with me that they're political.
Yeah. I'm watching it over here. I'm like, yeah, okay. He's got your back. But I'm really in the same vein with you, Cameron, where it is a political act as we see it, and to them it could have been a revenge act. It could have been, this is karma. This is the way it's going to be. But also, I think for us looking back, I think it's also an act of politicizing the moment and making it short as a statement. It's saying we're going to be free. This is what we're going to have, and we want what's rightfully ours. And I think it can be seen that way as well. And I really think that kind of like when we had to talk at the Gary Owen about Civil War letters. We said, are these letters political? Well, is what's being said here political as well, even by the author of the memoir or the diary? Yeah, it can be.
I think it's important to note that those African Americans who attacked that house, that was a second attack, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yes. And so the point being is this isn't something that's spontaneous that happened just in the moment. Clearly, there were people within the African American community, free people, who saw that house as a center of power and authority. There was a white man who was outside the house. That's how the scene opened, I believe. In fact, doesn't Kate look out? She sees that white man. He's surrounded by some black guys with guns. She says she feared for his life, and then said, "I'd never seen a black man with a weapon before." I think what all this tells me, and again, yes, political expressions we can find in all kinds of forms, without a doubt. And I'm not trying to diminish that expression that freed African American women did with clothing. I'm not diminishing that at all. I just think what this document does, and what both of you have said, it reminds me of how tumultuous the home front was, that I so often, when I think about the home front, because I often think about it in relationship to the military, which I think maybe is a mistake, that sometimes we should just look at the home front in a sense in isolation. And again, as a second front, not a second front that was cut off from the war, but a second front where the war was actually occurring, right? Where there was violence. And that violence, as you've just pointed out, Cameron, was not connected to mainline armies, at least not in this incident, right? It's not connected.
I think Kate Houck and Mike Froning in the comments brought up a great point. Mike Froning first said, "Are we going to assume this happened as reported?" And second, Kate Houck said, "How do we know that any of her account is true versus a dramatically embellished memoir and mourning of her lost high society life?" That's an interesting.
Yeah,
Who was that last person? Was that Kate who said that?
Kate said the second. Yes, yes. Kate.
Yeah. There's no solidarity amongst Kates. Clearly, she's throwing Kate Stone under the bus here. You know what? I'm with our Kate. I like what she has to say.
I think those are both really good questions that get to a broader point about reading the diaries of Southern women and taking them critically. If Kate Stone told me that the sky was blue on this day, I would probably look for a meteorological report to make sure the sky was blue, because these are narratives and this is her lens, how she's viewing it. And so I think that I think that it needs to be taken cautiously. Some of the details, I think, could be her imagining them retrospectively. She refers to later on in her diary, really, that she's traumatized by this and that she kind of believes this alters her. Her mom doesn't have this experience, and her mom kind of makes a flippant comment about this experience a few days later, and Stone's like, well, if you had a gun, writes in her diary, if mom had a gun to her head, she wouldn't think this is funny. And I think Stone, as being a young woman, she's in her early 20s when this happens, versus her mom's, older. That also, I think, is changing how she views this.
So I'm curious, would you consider what happened in that house to be an act of sexual violence against the white women there? I didn't say rape, I said sexual violence.
Yes, I would definitely think it is, because infringing on Stone's dress in so many ways was a transgression against her gendered identity. That the dress was this isolating force. It demonstrated her femininity. It demonstrated her status as an elite woman. And that is all taken from her in that incident. I don't think it's any coincidence that after this incident, not long after this incident, Stone stops wearing the hoop skirt. And Drew Gilpin Faust makes this point in her chapter on clothing and gender in Mothers of Invention, that the clothing seemed to have failed its purpose in protecting Southern women. And I think there is at least wartime abandonment of it then. So I think there's enough in terms of the gendered aspects of it that I would consider it sexual violence. I think that's how Stone would see it.
I'm just going to keep going here. The Kate who had that excellent question. I'm thinking about what Kate said in her comment. And so if there was rape, do you think Kate Stone would have reported it? And you can say that's a dumb question. We'll never know, but I don't think it is. Obviously, I wouldn't.
No, I think it's a valid question. How would Stone have written about it?
Would she have?
And I think those are good questions. And I don't know if there is a Southern woman somewhere, I'm sure maybe there is, who writes about the experience of being raped. How would the terms be used? I don't think it would be a long, elaborate passage. I think it would be something brief, especially when you add in the racial dynamics of it. Thomas Forster, I don't want to get this right. Thomas Foster wrote a book on sexual violations of enslaved men that talks about white women and black men in sexual encounters, where white women initiated the sexual contact. And I think that might be the closest we get to finding textual clues to evidence of sexual assault in Southern diaries.
Well, I would say that for women, that it was, of course, an incident that they felt such shame about, even though they clearly never felt responsible for it. But the way that it could have potentially been perceived, that I suspect that many did not write about it in their diaries. Even fewer would have gone public with it. I've looked at a few court cases in the Union Army, court cases in which white and black soldiers were tried. They're not as many as one might imagine. In fact, Joe Glatar, in his study of Sherman's army during the Carolina campaign of 1864, he found just a few incidents that were in fact tried, and those incidents were against women of color. So it's very hard, again, to get the numbers. It's been grossly underreported. There's no doubt about that. And I think, Cameron, what you said about the sexual violence that occurred in the house, that's without question the case. I suspect that permeated many Southern households when Union soldiers approached. But there's a historian at Yale, Crystal, is either Feaster or Feister. And she is, you can look her up on the internet. She did a brilliant piece, I thought, on Fort Jackson and an incident that occurred there with some white officers and African-American women who were laundry women. I won't get into the details, but it speaks to the difficulties in being able to really recover with any degree of certainty the sexual dynamics and violence that occurred. But you know that it's always present. But we also know this, and that's why this topic is so delicate and so difficult. Because after the war, this notion that former slaves, that they preyed upon white women, and that one of the great victims of Reconstruction was the loss of purity amongst Southern women, because so many former slaves had violated them. It's this gross and horrific distortion, this distortion that Black men can't be men, that they can only be animals, and that animalism, that it is often expressed in these horrific crimes against women. You know, why this topic, again, is so difficult to talk about, because Kate's diary feeds into that. It's fodder for that lost cause nonsense. And so, again, I appreciate what the other Kate wrote in her comments. I thought that was really useful.
Yeah, I immediately, when I read this for the first time, I immediately thought of Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, that's right.
Just feeding right into that, and that's where it's coming from.
John, can you tell everyone about Birth of a Nation real quickly, so some people might not know about the movie?
Yeah, it was a film in the early 20th century which just fed off of the white Southern narrative of the Lost Causer movement, where you have, I think it was black federal troops, or they are like preying on white women in the South. Violence being perpetrated by free blacks and black United States colored troops. You have the Birth of a Nation was basically the rise of the Klan coming about after the war. And most of the stuff that's in this film is, well, all of it is racially charged, but most of it is from this lost cause mentality of Reconstruction era. It was actually screened, and President Woodrow Wilson apparently gave 2 thumbs up to the film. But when I talk about Birth of a Nation in that regard, it's just that it took America by storm in the early 1900s, around the time of the First World War, and it became kind of like another lightning rod in this Lost Causer movement, because now it was in mass media, and people could run with it, and I dare say it led to some of the things that we have misunderstood that went into later on Gone with the Wind and other productions that still fed this lost causerism kind of a movement. And but Birth of a Nation was like putting the gasoline on the fire, and it really caused a wide-scale popular culture movement in that regard.
So I think, before we close here, we're getting close to 8 o'clock. Cameron, could you just some final thoughts? I think, especially things that you think that our audience would profit to read, whether it be a primary source or a secondary source. What
I have.
What you suggest?
Yeah, if you are interested in the things we've talked about tonight, there are a couple of books that I would 100% recommend, and I will say they're not for the faint of heart. These readings, kind of like our discussion shows, this is a complicated and delicate topic. So that's my disclaimer. Most recently, it's brand new, only in the last few months it's come out. And I referenced it earlier. I'll show the cover here. It's Thomas Foster's Rethinking Rufus, Sexual Violations of Enslaved Men. This book really changed the way I looked at the plantation household. It, to me, was an eye-opening book. Another big one.
Who published it? Who published it?
It's the University of Georgia in their Gender and Slavery series. It's a thin book, but I will say it's probably about just over 100 pages of text, but it's incredibly packed with great information, and I think is a great launching point for more studies. And another good one is Thavolia Glimpse, Out of the House of Bondage. Thavolia Glimpse has also written some journal articles. She was really one of the first historians I got to interact with. And so her work has definitely influenced my thinking. And the last one that I would say that's outside of the mainstream, I think Drew Gilpin Faust's Mother's Invention is the number one book we go to on women in the plantation household. I went to this rather large one. Took me a while to get through. Is Elizabeth Fox Genovese's Within the Plantation Household. This book was really the first one for me, or I should say the earliest chronological in terms of the historiography, where there's discussion about the way that clothing impacted the plantation household. Fox Genovese covers the subject on a few pages, and she gives a very strong, I think, argument for how plantation mistresses used fashion to control the enslaved. So those would be my 3 book recommendations. And I think for primary source material, anything that any diary of a Southern woman, I think, is going to give different indications of it. Because fashion is so important and such a sensitive topic, I think a lot of diaries are going to have passing references to it for readers to pick up on.
Could you hold up Kate's book one more time?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, your copy won't come with all of the sticky notes. This took me more than my fair share of.
We won't get all your insights.
Right? Yeah. But this is Broken Burn. Drew Gilpin Faust wrote a wonderful introduction. I think it's a fascinating primary source, and my favorite comment, Kate Hawk, we should all walk a mile in their hoop skirts. And Dr. Downs pointed out Thavolia Glimpse does have a new book out that just came out. I have a copy. I haven't gotten to read it, but if it's anywhere as good as Out of the House of Bondage, it'll be a must-read for sure.
Out of the House of Bondage is, I think, the best place to start. Elizabeth Fox Genovese certainly has had a great impact on the field, and Thavolia is deeply influenced by her work, but I think Thavolia is a good place to start. John, did you have any final thoughts here before we say goodbye?
Yes. First off, I think we should post links to all those books so people watching can check them out, because we're all shut in and we need something more to read in our life.
And even a link to the brilliant Erin Sheehan Dean's.
Yes.
You don't need to say brilliant before that if you want to get into LSU. That's where Erin teaches. You don't need to say that. You just.
I figured it wouldn't hurt to try. I figure it wouldn't hurt to slip it in there.
Yeah.
Like all of us, we fall prey to flattery. So yes.
But no, Cam. I think what you've showcased tonight is amazing, and I really enjoy the fact that you've connected with material culture, because that's where I really got my start, was in material culture. Now, granted, mine was uniforms and equipment, because that was where I was at. But I'm really liking seeing how this is transpiring as far as the historical narrative is concerned, because we're going into deeper questions than just what they wore. It's going into why they wore certain things, how they wore certain things, what was the symbolism of those garments or those articles of clothing. And I think that's a really important question to be asking as we read through these primary source documents. And you've highlighted that amazingly, because we need to be reading into these a little bit more. As far as like when Dr. Carmichael says about letters, we have to look into who's the audience. What are they trying to say to that audience? Same thing with material culture, and I think you highlighted that tremendously well tonight. So you get an A+ in my class.
I wish you were. I wish you were one of my professors. Now, I wish we could convince Dr. Carmichael of some of that.
Some professors are easy graders, and some professors aren't. So.
Yeah, I guess so. I like deep thought, and it's not. It's the material culture can be a really deep subject if you make it that way, and I really like that. I really like what you chose here.
Cameron, thank you so much. I know next week we have 2 shows, do we not, John? Our first show is a Monday or Tuesday?
First show is Monday. Chris Gwynn will be on talking about interpreting the Round Top and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So that's Monday the 13th.
And Thursday is Harold Holzer, I believe.
Yes, Harold Holzer is coming on Thursday, invoking Lincoln at times of crisis, and that'll be Thursday at 7.
That's right.
So we won't have a late start that night. We're going to be on time.
Well, I need to run here and join my household of 3 women. And I'll be more sensitive to their fashion statements. I will now see their fashion statements as political statements. You changed my thinking there.
There you go. Thanks, guys.
All right, you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Cameron.